My name is Claire Montgomery, and I grew up surrounded by illusions. Not the kind you see on a stage, but the ones you wear like a second skin. Tonight, we were in Charleston, South Carolina. Charleston isn't just a city, it's a performance. A promise of old Southern grandeur, of history carved into moss-covered oaks and white-columned porches. It holds the promise that some secrets should remain buried beneath the azaleas and the Spanish moss. Tonight, we were celebrating the 70th birthday of my grandmother, Evelyn Montgomery. The mansion was spectacular. One of those estates that doesn't just house wealth, but crushes you with it. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, deceptive glow over smiling faces. A quartet played soft classical music, a melody designed to soothe any rising anxiety. The air smelled like expensive French champagne and imported perfume, a mixture of aspiration and decay. It was a perfect performance. And my grandmother, Evelyn, was the lead actress. She was perfect, as always. At 70, she carried a grace untouched by time and worry. Her dress was slate gray silk, simple in cut, but surely worth more than my annual salary as a journalist in New York. Her silver hair was tied in a flawless, untouchable chignon. Her smile was a work of art, precise, polished, and completely impenetrable. She didn't walk among the guests. She floated, a queen in her kingdom. She laughed softly, her hand brushing an arm here, acknowledging a glass there. I watched her from a corner of the ballroom. I had always admired her. I had always, in a deep and quiet place, feared her, too. And then there was him, my grandfather, Richard Montgomery, 73. But he refused to grow old or see the spotlight. He was the center of the universe. His voice was loud, his laugh expansive, filling the room in a way that left no space for other sounds. He wore a tailored suit that screamed success. He held his champagne glass like a scepter, a man accustomed to command. Richard Montgomery loved being admired, loved being the patriarch, the empire builder. Tonight, he was celebrating the woman who had made all of it possible, or so he told everyone. "My dear Evelyn," he boomed to a group of business partners, his hand possessive on her waist. Not quite a caress, more like a claim. 50 years of patience, it's her greatest talent. People laughed. A respectful, rehearsed laugh, just like all the other polite falsehoods floating in the room. In our family, false was not a flaw. It was a necessary virtue, a second nature. It was survival. My Uncle Peter, their only son, stood miserably near the buffet, 49, and he still looked like an anxious teenager, waiting for his father's approval. He was the heir, the future of the Montgomery name. But he lived in the crushing shadow of Richard. He kept checking his phone, his face tight and damp with sweat. The crushing weight of the family's honor seemed to rest entirely on his fragile shoulders. He hated surprises, and in this house, everything was a surprise, hidden just beneath the surface. And finally there was Caroline Hayes, sitting at a small table slightly off to the side, as she always did, 69 years old. She wore a modest, almost anonymous beige dress, the color of invisibility. Caroline was the family friend, my grandmother's closest companion. She had been around for as long as I could remember, a soft, almost spectral presence. A woman who rarely spoke but always seemed to be listening to something no one else could hear. I caught her looking at my grandfather, just for a second. A quick, almost invisible glance that had the weight of 50 years of history compressed into it. It was gone instantly, replaced by the blankness of her beige dress and her downcast eyes. Then she lowered her gaze to her empty plate, succeeding in making herself invisible again. My grandmother, Evelyn, walked toward her table, the only time she stopped circulating. "Caroline, darling," Evelyn said in her clear, calm voice, a voice that never wavered. "I'm so glad you're here." "Evelyn," Caroline whispered back, her voice barely audible, wavering. "You look beautiful. 70 suits you so well." They held hands across the table. Two women who knew each other better than anyone else in that suffocating room, yet were utterly strangers to the crowd. I felt a deep, profound uneasiness. The perfection of the evening was suffocating, and I knew, as a journalist, that the most perfect narratives always hid the biggest lies. The master of ceremony, a young man with a blinding professional smile, stepped onto the small stage near the grand piano. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, with an energy that felt jarringly fake, "it's time to honor our wonderful Evelyn. We've prepared a little retrospective of her extraordinary life." The main lights dimmed. The quartet fell silent, and a massive white screen hidden behind velvet curtains flickered to life. The room grew still, everyone ready for the next act of the performance. The first images were exactly what I expected. A young Evelyn, in New York during the 70s. She had been a painter then, before Richard. Beautiful, fiery, alive in a way I had never seen her. Then, the wedding. Evelyn and Richard, radiant. The perfect kiss on the church steps. Peter's birth. The perfect family in the manicured garden of that very mansion. The photos continued. A relentless parade of glory. Vacations, gala dinners, the opening of Montgomery Steele's first factory. Richard shaking hands with politicians. Evelyn cutting ceremonial ribbons, always beside him, always supporting. An entire life spent smiling for the camera. A life crafted for public consumption. A relentless chronicle of public success, meticulously edited to remove any trace of human struggle or imperfection. It went on for minutes, a mesmerizing lie. Then, the flicker. The perfect parade of photos came to an abrupt, screeching halt. The music track, a saccharine piano melody, skipped. The screen, blindingly white for a fraction of a second, flickered. It wasn't a graceful transition or a minor glitch. It was a digital stutter, a sudden rupture in the flawless fabric of the Montgomery narrative. Then, it appeared. Just a few seconds, maybe 3. The image was blurry, grainy, and old, like a damaged piece of celluloid found buried in the dirt. It showed a small, dimly lit room, definitely not the palatial settings of the previous photos. It looked like a studio, perhaps. On the left side of the frame, a young Evelyn stood, facing away from the camera, her silhouette tense. She was wearing a simple, dark dress that swallowed her fire. Her hands were clasped in front of her, the picture of rigidity. The light in the room was cold, unforgiving, and in the background, out of focus, 2 other figures were locked in an embrace. Richard, unmistakably Richard. Younger, leaner, but with that same arrogant set to his shoulders. He was holding the other person, pulling them close. The angle was awkward, the movement shaky, suggesting the person holding the camera was either terrified or unsteady. The other figure was a woman. Her face was obscured by Richard's massive shoulder, but the silhouette of her hair, short, dark, distinct, made my heart drop. It was Caroline, young Caroline. It wasn't a polite hug. It was intimate, too intimate, possessive, dangerous. The room held its breath. The air, already thick with expectation, solidified into ice. I could hear the sharp, quickening beat of my own heart in the sudden, absolute silence. The quartet, which had been silent for the video, now felt miles away, unreachable. The screen returned to normal, showing a still photo of the grand Charleston mansion, the pillar of respectability. But the silence remained. It was a physical thing. A heavy shroud dropped over the 100 or so guests. The truth, ugly and raw, had just slammed its way onto the screen for 3 agonizing seconds. A secret, carefully guarded for half a century, had leaked out like poison gas. My first impulse was journalistic. Who did it? How did it get in? But the deeper, colder impulse was personal. My family is a lie. I scanned the faces. My grandmother, Evelyn. She was standing next to the small stage. For that eternal second, her perfect smile shattered. Her face became a mask of cold, stark, white marble. Her eyes, usually so bright with controlled intelligence, were dead. I saw the fracture, the first, deep crack in the porcelain surface she had spent a lifetime perfecting. It was gone as quickly as it came, her mouth snapping shut, her chin lifting. But I had seen it. I had seen the true cost of her performance. Richard, my grandfather, he stood rigid, his hand still holding a flute of champagne, but his grip was so tight, I expected the glass to explode. His face was blotchy red. His jaw worked, trying to find the words to reclaim the narrative, but nothing came out. For the first time, Richard Montgomery was silenced. He was caught. Peter, my uncle, he was sweating profusely now. He looked like a deer caught in the headlights, small and helpless. He stared at the screen, then at his parents, then back at the screen, as if trying to calculate the damage, the shame his father had brought down on the family name. The weight on his shoulders had just become unbearable. And Caroline Hayes, she was still sitting at her peripheral table. She hadn't moved. Her shoulders were shaking, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement. But I knew she was crying. She wasn't looking at Richard or Evelyn or the screen. She was staring down at her lap, lost in a memory the entire room had just been forced to share. The master of ceremony, bless his heart, found his voice, as it was a high, strained squeak. Ah, technical difficulty. My deepest apologies, ladies and gentlemen. A little glitch in the archive system. He stumbled off the stage, rushing toward the technician tucked away in the shadows. Evelyn took control. She always did. She lifted her glass, the slate gray silk of her sleeve catching the light. Her voice was steady, impossibly calm, cutting through the thick silence like a diamond blade. Technical glitches, like small scandals, only serve to remind us that life, even a life well lived, is never without its little imperfections. She paused, her eyes sweeping the room, challenging anyone to contradict her. Please, do continue to enjoy yourselves. There is plenty more champagne. A nervous ripple of laughter spread through the crowd. The polite applause of people desperate to pretend they hadn't just witnessed a corporate takeover of a marriage. The performance resumed. The quartet started playing again, too loudly, too quickly. Waiters rushed to refill glasses. Everyone made a concerted, painful effort to erase the last 3 seconds from existence. They airbrushed the moment from their collective memory right there and then. I couldn't move. I felt physically sickened by the speed and efficiency of the cover-up. It was a masterclass in denial. This was how the Montgomery world worked. When a truth threatened to break the surface, you didn't deal with it. You simply cemented the crack over with a lie, poured more money on top, and moved on. The lie was the foundation. I saw Richard approach Peter, his voice now a low, dangerous growl. Fix this, Peter. Find out who did it, now. Peter just nodded, his face pale, already running for the back rooms to interrogate the hapless technician. He was always the fixer, never the owner. Evelyn walked straight past her husband and son, her eyes fixed on one thing, Caroline. She stopped at Caroline's table. The two women didn't speak. Evelyn just placed her hand, heavy and ringed with diamonds, on top of Caroline's trembling hands. It wasn't a gesture of comfort. It felt like a warning, or perhaps a confirmation of a bond that transcended the man who had just betrayed them both, right there on the big screen. I realized then that the truth wasn't just about Richard's infidelity. It was about Evelyn's reaction to it, her lack of reaction, her profound practiced stillness. 50 years ago, she had seen that moment and done nothing. She hadn't left. She hadn't screamed. She had simply buried it, perfectly, underneath the Montgomery name. I needed air. I walked past the ballroom, past the marble foyer, and up the sweeping staircase. The house was now buzzing with the forced, brittle joy of the resumed party. The illusion was back in place, but it was fragile now, like a magnificent antique vase that had been dropped and glued back together. It looked whole from a distance, but the stress lines were visible upon close inspection. I went out onto the upper balcony. The air was cool and thick, smelling of the nearby sea and the heavy scent of magnolias. The vast, dark garden stretched out beneath me, an expanse of organized wilderness where no one could see or hear you. I leaned against the stone railing, watching the lights from the ballroom spill across the manicured lawn. My journalistic curiosity was fully awake now, overriding the obedient granddaughter in me. I had come home from New York for a birthday, expecting pomp and predictable pleasantries. I was leaving with a story, not a story for the newspaper, not yet, but the true, internal story of my family. A story about the things people sacrifice for reputation, for wealth, and for a kind of cold, functional stability that mimics happiness. I thought about the sheer volume of silence it must have taken to keep that image, that moment, locked away for 5 decades. Evelyn, Richard, and Caroline, they had all been living in a suffocating triangle of unspoken history, and I, and Peter, and all the rest of the family had been living in the gilded, airy mansion built on that lie. The scene below felt like a stage set after the final, devastating act. The lights were on, the actors were bowing, but the audience knew the tragedy had just begun. A thought settled in my stomach, cold and heavy. The person who put that video on the screen was telling the truth. The entire room had immediately chosen the lie. Which side was I on? New York had taught me to chase the truth. Charleston had taught me to revere the lie. I looked down at the wide garden. In the house behind me, the world of the Montgomery family was not just beginning to shake. It had already shattered, and they were desperately sweeping up the pieces. For the first time in my life, I felt the truth wanting to escape. A seismic shift beneath the foundations of the mansion, and I knew it wouldn't just pull the 3 main actors into the abyss. It would take all of us down. The family was about to pay the ultimate price for perfection. I stayed on the balcony for a long time. Below, the party was in full swing, a forced symphony of denial. It was all a mirage now, one I could no longer inhabit. The air of New York, the brisk honesty of my journalistic life, suddenly felt like a lifeline. I was the outsider here, the one who had seen the trick behind the curtain. And once you see the trick, the magic is gone forever. I finally stepped back inside, my body moving stiffly, as if covered in dried plaster. The objective of the evening had shifted for me. It was no longer about celebrating Evelyn's life. It was about investigating the hole in it. The 3 seconds of grainy footage had become my compass. I had to know the full story, not just the edited version, not for a Pulitzer, but for the raw, desperate need to understand the architecture of my own emotional inheritance. I found Peter in the study, his hand shaking as he tried to call someone, likely the head of security, or maybe a high-powered attorney, the kind they kept on retainer to erase digital footprints. He looked up, his face relief mixing with suspicion when he saw me. "Claire, what are you doing up here? The party is downstairs." His voice was thin, reedy, the sound of a man crumbling under pressure. "I was getting air, Peter. It's thick down there." I kept my voice calm, neutral. I didn't want to spook him. "Did you find out about the video?" He visibly winced at the word video. "A technical issue. An old archival clip that somehow corrupted the main file. It's been dealt with." The technician was highly negligent. He was repeating the official narrative, already wrote. Negligent or deliberate? I pushed, watching his eyes. Peter's anxiety ratcheted up instantly. "Claire, stop. Don't start with your reporter instincts here. This is family. This is mom and dad. You need to drop this, now." His fear was palpable. A foul odor in the polished room. He wasn't afraid of the truth. He was afraid of Richard. I saw Grandma's face, Peter. And I saw Caroline. He ran his hand through his hair, defeated. "Caroline is just a family friend. She always has been. Look, whatever happened 50 years ago is dust. It's buried. And we keep it buried, understood? That's how we survive in this town. That's how we stay Montgomery." His plea was the real confession, the core tenet of the Montgomery faith. Silence is survival. I left him there, a prisoner in his own inheritance, and walked back towards the party, now seeing the guests not as celebrating friends, but as co-conspirators in a decades-long theatrical production. It was then I ran into Richard. He was standing alone by the massive fireplace, the light glinting of the gold signet ring on his finger. He looked like an ancient Roman emperor, momentarily pausing to admire his own empire. He saw me coming and fixed me with a gaze that had always intimidated me, a mix of patriarchal affection and cold, calculating assessment. "There's my little firecracker," he said, his booming voice slightly lower than usual, laced with forced charm. "Thinking of running back to the dirty streets of New York? Or have you finally decided to come home and take your rightful place?" "I like the dirty streets, grandfather," I replied, allowing my journalistic shell to harden. "They don't lie to your face." His smile vanished. The shift was instantaneous and terrifying. "Watch your tone, Claire. You're talking to your family. I'm talking to the man who just had his 50-year-old affair broadcast to a room full of his closest peers. I'd say the time for watching my tone has passed." A muscle twitched violently in his jaw. This was the true Richard, the one who built the steel company and broke men who stood in his way. The gentle patriarch was gone. It was a childish prank. A mistake. You read too much into things, Claire. You always did. That's why you're a third-rate hack in a second-rate city, instead of being here, where you matter. He was attacking my career, my identity, to deflect from his guilt. The tactic was brutal, yet predictable. It wasn't a mistake, it was the truth. And the way you and Grandma and Peter all scrambled to put the mask back on, that's the real story. "What are you all hiding, grandfather? It's more than just an affair with Caroline, isn't it?" Richard stepped closer, his physical presence overwhelming. The smell of expensive cologne and cigar smoke enveloped me. His eyes were cold, hard chips of granite. "You are a child playing with fire. You don't know what you're talking about. Caroline Hayes is a dear friend of this family, a loyal friend to Evelyn. Her role is important, necessary, and you will not poison that relationship or our reputation with your cynical little theories." He gripped my arm, not hard enough to bruise, but hard enough to warn. "Go back to New York, Claire. Go back to your life. The past here belongs to us. It is not your inheritance to dig up." I pulled my arm away, my skin crawling where his fingers had been. My inheritance is this silence, grandfather, and I don't want it. I walked away from him, my heart hammering, but my mind suddenly clear. His reaction confirmed my deepest suspicion. The affair wasn't the secret. The relationship was the secret. Richard had alluded to Caroline's necessary and important role. He hadn't just cheated on Evelyn, he was using Caroline as a tool, or maybe even a shield, in some larger, unacknowledged agreement. His protective fury wasn't about Evelyn's feelings, it was about the structure of power he had established. I looked across the room and saw Evelyn. She was now sitting with a group of friends, her posture impeccable, her laughter musical. But when her eyes met mine across the crowd, there was a flicker of something raw and exposed. Not anger at me, but a deep, shared melancholy. It was the look of a woman who had traded her soul for silence, and who knew, in that moment, that I had seen the ledger. That night, I couldn't sleep. The mansion felt like a mausoleum. Every creak in the floorboards was a whisper of history. I pulled out my old laptop and started digging. I searched the Montgomery archives, the public records, anything I could access from my private account. Richard was right. I was a reporter. And now I had a story that was personal, urgent, and dangerously complex. I began to catalog the gaps in the family narrative. The missing years in the photo albums Peter had claimed were lost in a move. Evelyn's art career. It didn't just end, it disappeared overnight, coinciding exactly with the formation of Montgomery Steel. And then Caroline. I searched her name. She had inherited a sizable trust fund, discreetly managed by the Montgomery legal team years ago. The amount was enormous, far more than a family friend would receive. This wasn't charity, it was payment, a stipend for half a century of silence. But the most chilling discovery wasn't financial. It was an old, scanned newspaper clipping from the early 1970s, a society page item announcing the initial engagement of Evelyn Dubois and Richard Montgomery. Tucked away in a footnote, almost impossible to see, was a brief mention of a small art gallery showing in the area, featuring a talented young local artist named Caroline Hayes. The clip mentioned that Evelyn and Caroline had become fast friends, while Evelyn was in town visiting her fiancé, Richard. I zoomed in on the photo accompanying the art show announcement. It was a picture of Evelyn and Caroline standing side by side. Evelyn was radiant, her hand resting affectionately on Caroline's shoulder. They looked young, vibrant, and incredibly close. There was a spark between them, an undeniable chemistry that transcended polite friendship. Richard was nowhere in the frame. The image I was looking at wasn't one of rivalry or betrayal. It was one of connection, of shared joy. I looked at the 3-second video in my memory, Richard embracing Caroline while Evelyn stood alone. The narrative I had accepted, the man cheating on his wife with her best friend, felt too simple, too conventional for the labyrinthine cruelty of the Montgomery family. I closed the laptop, the glowing screen reflecting in my wide-open eyes. The truth was not about Richard's lust. It was about his control. He hadn't just committed adultery. He had, somehow, orchestrated a situation that bound two women together and simultaneously crushed their potential happiness, using the immense weight of his money and reputation. He hadn't destroyed Evelyn's marriage. He had destroyed her love and then forced her to live beside the woman she might have truly loved. All for the sake of a dynasty. The silence in the mansion seemed to roar now. It wasn't the silence of things unsaid, but the silence of things violently erased. I felt the full, crushing weight of my family's history, a history built on sacrificing genuine connection for the sake of the performance. And the realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. I was not just investigating my grandparents' past, I was fighting for my own future, to avoid becoming the next woman whose voice and love were swallowed by the Montgomery name. The day after the party felt less like a Sunday morning and more like a carefully orchestrated corporate takeover. The tension in the Montgomery mansion was a living thing, heavy and cold, clinging to the velvet curtains and the antique furniture. Everyone was present for the ritual Sunday brunch, but no one was truly there. We were all actors in the aftermath, playing the roles of the unbothered elite. Evelyn, as expected, was the paragon of composure. She wore a tailored linen suit and discussed the upcoming charity gala with an unwavering, cheerful certainty. Her voice was too bright, her gestures too precise. She behaved as if the video incident was merely a misfiring firework, loud, briefly distracting, but ultimately irrelevant to the grandeur of the celebration. This forced normalcy was more terrifying than an outright explosion. It was the sound of the cement hardening over the crack. Richard was less successful in his performance. He was loud, aggressive, constantly barking orders at Peter, who looked like he hadn't slept at all. Richard kept his hands busy, flipping through the financial section of the Post and Courier, but his eyes flickered constantly, scanning the room for signs of judgment or rebellion. His control was frantic, desperate. Caroline was gone. She hadn't appeared for brunch. Peter told me, in a low, tight whisper near the silver coffee urn, that she had decided to take an impromptu trip to the coast. She needed to rest, Claire. She's getting old, and all the excitement. He trailed off, avoiding my eyes. He didn't believe his own lie. Caroline didn't need rest. She was either hiding from the fallout or had been strategically removed by Richard. A loose end snipped clean. But her absence was a presence. It was the gaping wound in the room, the secret that everyone was desperately trying to bandage, with polite conversation about the stock market and garden renovations. I knew I couldn't stay silent. The journalist in me, the one trained to chase the scent of a cover-up, was in a state of high alert. This wasn't just a simple case of historical adultery. This was a sophisticated, decades-long psychological arrangement. I wasn't going to New York until I understood the cost of this arrangement, not just the details. My investigation started with the physical space. I went to the second-floor library, a room filled with heavy, leather-bound books that no one ever read. I was looking for the missing years Peter had mentioned. I pulled down dusty albums, feeling the thick, acid-free pages beneath my fingertips. I compared dates. In the album covering 68 to 1975, there was a jump, a clear, deliberate discontinuity. Photos went from 1970, Evelyn and Richard's engagement party, all smiles and sparkling crystal, straight to 1975, a photo of Peter as a 2-year-old on the mansion steps. 5 years vanished. 5 years that covered Evelyn's move from New York, her early marriage, the establishment of Montgomery Steel, and, I suspected, the period of the video footage and the intense bond with Caroline. Someone had physically removed a block of history, a surgical erasure. The action itself, the removal of the pages, spoke volumes. It was not careless. It was meticulous. It suggested that Evelyn, or perhaps Richard, had actively curated their past, sacrificing entire seasons of their lives to create the acceptable family narrative. The weight of that decision, the mental discipline required to sustain such a calculated historical void, felt overwhelming. My next step was to talk to the periphery, the people who were paid to watch. I found Mrs. Gable, the oldest housekeeper, in the laundry room, folding enormous white sheets. She had been with the family since the late 60s. She was a woman of quiet dignity, with eyes that held endless, unspoken knowledge. Mrs. Gable, I said softly, leaning against the doorframe, I need to ask you about the time before I was born, the early years of Mr. and Mrs. Montgomery. She paused in her folding, her hands stilling a sheet. She didn't look up, but I felt her attention sharpen. The early years were busy, Miss Claire. Always busy. Parties, new businesses, travel. And Miss Caroline? She started folding again, her movements tight. Miss Caroline was a good friend to Mrs. Montgomery. Always a good friend. She had her own apartment downtown, but she spent most of her time here. She helped Mrs. Montgomery with many things. Did Mr. Montgomery approve of her being here so often? I asked, pushing the crucial point. Mrs. Gable sighed, a sound like dry leaves rustling. Mr. Montgomery approved of anything that made Mrs. Montgomery happy, Miss Claire. He always said, Evelyn needs her supports. We all have our roles. We all have our roles. Richard's words from last night echoed in the mouth of the housekeeper. It confirmed my theory. This was a carefully negotiated power structure, not a passionate fling. Caroline was not just a mistress. She was a tolerated, maybe even necessary fixture. Her presence served some purpose for Richard, perhaps as a way to control Evelyn, or maybe as a living symbol of a victory he won over her years ago. The constant tension, the fear of discovery, the years of silence, it all began to leach into my own life. I started looking at my own boyfriend back in New York, a successful lawyer named Ethan, with suspicion. If my entire family history was built on exquisite deception, how could I trust the easy, honest affection I shared with him? When he was late, calling me that evening, a cold, unreasonable doubt settled in my stomach. Was he lying? Was he living a separate life? I realized with a jolt of panic. The Montgomery lie was contagious. It wasn't just their secret. It was becoming my fear. I was starting to replicate the emotional paralysis of my grandmother, anticipating betrayal, seeking the fracture before it happened. The legacy of Montgomery was the inability to trust simplicity and genuine emotion. The next day, I made an appointment to meet Caroline. I knew Richard would have forbidden it, so I did it discreetly, sending a handwritten note to her downtown apartment, bypassing the family's communication channels. We agreed to meet at an obscure cafe near the harbor, far from the polished marble of Charleston society. I found her sitting alone at a small, wrought iron table overlooking the choppy, cold gray sea. She looked worn, aged beyond her years. The anonymity of the beige dress had been replaced by the quiet despair of a woman finally exposed. I sat down, bypassing the usual pleasantries. I saw the video, Caroline, and I saw the way you and Grandma looked at each other. What was your relationship with my grandfather? Was it love? Caroline flinched. She picked up her coffee cup, her hands shaking so badly she had to put it down. Tears, slow and heavy, welled up in her eyes and tracked paths down her lined cheeks. She didn't wipe them. It wasn't what you think, Claire, she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. Or maybe exactly what you think. Richard was a mistake. A brief, terrible power move. But Evelyn and I... She swallowed hard, her chest hitching. Evelyn and I were the thing that was real in this city. Before he got to her. Before the money. Before the name. Before the perfect life. She leaned in, her voice dropping to a painful confession. Evelyn needed me here. She needed a piece of the truth, however tarnished, however controlled, to stay sane. Richard knew that. He knew he could take everything from her, her art, her freedom, even her body, through the marriage. But if he took me away entirely, she would break. So he kept me close. As a constant, painful reminder of what he had taken and what he now permitted her to keep. He kept us bound in a silent, suffocating agreement. So Evelyn knew about the affair and accepted it? I asked, trying to process the monstrous complexity of this cruelty. Evelyn orchestrated it, Claire, Caroline choked out, finally wiping her face with a napkin. She let it happen. She was broken by the sheer scale of the dynasty he offered, the pressure to become Mrs. Montgomery, the wife of the power builder. She thought that if she gave Richard what he wanted, the public perfection, the sun, the silence, that she could somehow keep the soul of her life with me, in secret. That was the bargain, her public life for his name, her private feeling for my presence. But silence always takes more than it gives. I sat back, stunned by the sheer, tragic scope of the agreement. This wasn't infidelity, it was psychological warfare, and corporate merger combined. Evelyn hadn't just been betrayed by Richard. She had collaborated in her own imprisonment, and Caroline was her fellow inmate, paid to stay close and remind Evelyn of the life she had forfeited. Caroline's last words to me, before she quickly excused herself, were devastating. You're a journalist, Claire. You chase facts. But the most terrible fact in this family is this. They don't just speak lies. They live them. And it destroys your capacity for a normal, imperfect life. Get out of here. Don't become like us. I left the cafe feeling colder than the sea air. Caroline hadn't given me a scandal. She had given me a tragedy. Richard hadn't been an adulterer. He had been an architect of emotional destruction, using the two most important women in his life as pawns to ensure his own dominance. I now understood Richard's true power. It wasn't his money or his influence, but his ability to control the truth between people. That night, I drove back to the mansion, the heavy iron gates closing behind me with a sound of finality. I parked the car and looked up at the familiar, imposing white columns. I knew the house was beautiful, but now I saw it for what it truly was, a monument to the things that were lost, sacrificed on the altar of reputation. I walked through the darkened library once more, thinking about the missing photo album pages. They weren't just missing moments of an affair, they were the record of a real, authentic relationship, a love that had been meticulously cut out of history by the hand of the man who sought to own the narrative. I felt a sudden, fierce protectiveness toward Evelyn, not the polished, perfect woman she was now, but the young artist who had loved so fiercely. She tried to negotiate a place for it within the cold walls of a dynastic marriage. My last stop was the portrait gallery, a long hallway lined with the stiff, formal images of dead Montgomery men and their equally formidable wives. I stopped in front of Evelyn's official portrait, painted 2 decades ago. She was beautiful, dressed in deep velvet, radiating power and serenity. But now, all I saw was the faint, desperate tension around her eyes. The eyes of a woman who had spent 20 years watching her life from a distance. I felt a sharp personal connection to her pain. I realized that Richard's power had been passed down through the generations, silently crippling the women who carried the Montgomery name. I looked at the portrait and whispered, "I won't keep your secret for you, Grandma. I won't become one of your ghosts." The revelation from Caroline that her presence was Evelyn's calculated, tragic compromise fueled a new, colder intensity in my investigation. I was no longer chasing a simple love triangle. I was uncovering a financial and emotional contract. The affair was the smokescreen. The controlled relationship between the two women was the master agreement. And agreements always leave a paper trail. I couldn't access the Montgomery Steele accounts, but I had a knack for finding discreet public records. I spent the next few days holed up in the attic study, pretending to sort through old family correspondence. My laptop was open to public records databases and obscure non-profit filings. I focused on the mysterious endowments Caroline Hayes was supposedly involved in, which Peter had inadvertently mentioned in his moment of panic. It turned out that Caroline wasn't just receiving a trust fund, she was the sole, silent trustee of the Hayes Montgomery Arts Foundation. The name itself was a small, agonizing joke. This foundation received massive, quarterly infusions of cash from shell corporations linked directly to Montgomery Steele. The purpose of the foundation, according to its mandate, was to provide grants for emerging Southern female artists, specifically those focused on abstract painting and portraiture. Evelyn's forgotten art. The financial data painted a picture of absolute, terrifying control. Richard wasn't just paying Caroline for silence about his infidelity. He was funding the very thing Evelyn loved, art, and channeling it through the woman Evelyn loved. He had turned Evelyn's passion and her deep emotional connection into a controlled, taxable, and thoroughly emasculated subsidiary of the Montgomery Empire. Caroline's stipend was the cost of her compliance. The foundation was the price of Evelyn's broken heart, paid out in quarterly installments to keep her close, silent, and creatively starved. Richard had achieved total victory. He had taken the woman Evelyn loved, controlled her financially, and turned Evelyn's own suppressed artistic identity into a bureaucratized charitable organization run by her former lover. It was a masterpiece of cold-blooded, emotional ownership. The air in the mansion was growing increasingly toxic. Richard and Evelyn were no longer performing for the guests, because the guests had largely left. Now they were performing for each other, and for Peter, and for me. The polite smiles were gone, replaced by a cutting, razor-sharp silence. One evening, I witnessed a silent, chilling confrontation in the dining room. Evelyn was arranging a large centerpiece of white lilies, the Southern symbol of polished elegance. Richard entered, holding a newspaper with a bold headline about Montgomery Steele's latest political donation. He cleared his throat. "Evelyn, I need you to review this draft statement for the Post and Courier. It's about the video incident. A final, definitive statement on the technical error that happened at your party." Evelyn didn't look up from the lilies. Her hands were meticulous, snapping off a damaged leaf with unnatural precision. "I believe Peter has handled the technical aspects, Richard. My name is not needed on a statement about server failure." "Your name is needed on everything, Evelyn," Richard said, his voice hard. "It validates the lie. It lends it respectability. You are the injured party, the devoted wife. Your signature ends the conversation." She finally looked at him. Her eyes were not angry, which would have been easier to bear, but utterly devoid of warmth. They were the eyes of someone looking at an enemy she was too exhausted to fight. "You mistake compliance for validation, Richard, and my silence only proves I value the Montgomery name more than my own pride. It does not validate your version of events." "And what is your version of events, Evelyn?" he challenged, stepping toward the table, his hand slamming down on the linen. The lilies shook. "Are you going to tell them that you're a woman who almost threw away everything, this house, the security, your son's future, for a childish infatuation with a penniless artist? Are you going to tell them you nearly ruined the Montgomery name before it even began?" The word infatuation was the knife. It dismissed the deep, sustained love she felt for Caroline as a momentary lapse of judgment. Evelyn didn't flinch. Her voice dropped to a barely audible register, more terrifying than a shout. No, Richard, I won't tell them. Because if I start telling the truth about me, I will have to tell the truth about you. About how you took an innocent woman's love for a friend and leveraged it into a 50-year contract of silence and shame. About how you found the single thing I valued and made it dependent on your charity. She looked down at the lilies, her gaze intense. And that, Richard, is a far uglier story than a simple affair. Richard's face was the color of old leather. He knew she had seen his true game decades ago. He knew the financial architecture he had built was a monument not to wealth, but to his own psychological cruelty. He scooped up the draft statement and stormed out, leaving a violent void in the dining room. I stood frozen in the hallway, unseen, my whole body shaking. The confrontation confirmed everything Caroline had said. Evelyn wasn't just a victim. She was a participant in a decades-long Cold War, and she knew the coordinates of Richard's deepest vulnerability, the truth of his ownership. The stress of this environment was pushing me to the brink. I started looking at my phone, staring at Ethan's name, longing for the simple, unburdened truth of New York. But I couldn't call him. I felt contaminated, infected by the Montgomery sickness. How could I bring my simple, trusting love into this web of sophisticated lies? I realized that the greatest tragedy of my family wasn't the past betrayal. It was the way that past was destroying my capacity for a future free of suspicion. I thought about the family creed, a flawless performance. But there was a deeper, unwritten creed that governed us. We destroy the things we love to prove we own them. Richard had done it to Evelyn and Caroline. Peter was doing it to his own nervous system, destroying his peace to own the Montgomery legacy. And I was unconsciously starting to do it to Ethan, destroying my trust to prove I wasn't a fool. I knew I needed one more piece of the puzzle. I needed to see Evelyn's art. If the foundation existed to fund her type of art, what exactly was it? I went back to the attic. I spent hours searching the dusty corners, the forgotten trunks. Finally, tucked away under a pile of heavy drapes, I found a roll of old canvas paintings, tied with stiff twine. I carefully unrolled the largest canvas. It wasn't the abstract work the foundation funded. It was a portrait. A breathtaking, vibrant portrait of a young woman, sitting in a splash of golden light. Her expression was defiant, hopeful, and utterly alive. It was Caroline, young, vibrant Caroline, painted by a loving, expert hand. Her eyes were fixed on the painter, on Evelyn, with an intensity that was unmistakable. This wasn't a friend. This was a muse. This was a lover. The portrait was dated 1971, the precise year missing from the photo album. This painting wasn't just a piece of art. It was the physical, undeniable evidence of the truth that Richard had spent 50 years trying to erase. It was Evelyn's love, raw and passionate, captured on canvas before the perfect Southern performance began. I stood there, breathing in the smell of old oil paint and dust, holding the only true thing in that entire lying house. Evelyn hadn't just compromised. She had fought back, preserving her truth in a secret language, a portrait, which she then kept hidden, but close. The painting wasn't just for her. It was the key. It was the final, devastating answer to the question of what was lost. And I knew that if Richard found it, he would destroy it instantly. This was the one thing that could not be bought, paid for, or governed by the Hayes Montgomery Arts Foundation. It was the raw, passionate heart of the Montgomery lie. I carefully rolled the canvas back up, the weight of 50 years of silence now resting in my hands. Holding Caroline's portrait in my hands felt like holding a smoking gun, except the victim was not dead. She was merely entombed. This was the raw, undeniable proof of Evelyn's truth, a truth so vibrant it threatened to burn through the decades of silence. And I hid the rolled canvas beneath the floorboards in the dusty corner of the attic, knowing that if Richard found it, his destruction would be swift and absolute. But the real threat wasn't Richard or the canvas. It was the psychological contagion spreading inside me. The Montgomery house was a factory of suspicion, and I was its latest product. Back in New York, my relationship with Ethan had been characterized by a joyful, easy transparency. Now, that transparency felt naive, dangerous. If love could be weaponized, controlled, and suppressed for 50 years under a chandelier, what protection did my own simple affection have? When Ethan called that evening, his voice warm and familiar, I found myself cold-checking him. "You sound tired, Claire. Long day?" he asked. "Just dealing with family stuff," I said, listening to the static on the line, listening for any sign of hesitation in his voice. any microscopic crack. I'm sorry, sweetheart. I wish I was there to pull you out of that southern gloom. I was thinking of coming down this weekend, actually. I can book a flight tomorrow. His words, intended as comfort, hit me with a jolt of suspicion. Why the sudden offer? Is he trying to distract me? Is there something he's avoiding in New York? It was an insidious, irrational doubt, born directly from the toxic air of the Montgomery mansion. I was looking for the lie, not because he had given me reason, but because my family had taught me that the lie was always there, hidden behind the most reassuring words. I heard Evelyn's silent voice in my head. Don't dig into the past, darling. It buries us. But the past wasn't burying me. It was teaching me how to bury others. I was subconsciously creating a chasm of suspicion between me and the man I loved, replicating the emotional distance that had crippled my grandmother. The fear wasn't just their secret. It was the realization that I was inheriting the DNA of their emotional sterility. The next morning, I decided the time for subtle investigation was over. I needed to try and break through Evelyn's practiced armor, not as a journalist, but as the granddaughter who had just seen her grandmother's greatest love and her greatest sacrifice. On a dusty canvas, I found Evelyn in the sunroom, pruning a small, ancient bonsai tree. The miniature landscape was a perfect metaphor for her life, carefully cultivated, constrained, beautiful, but utterly captive. I sat across from her. Grandma, I know about the foundation, the Hayes Montgomery Arts Foundation. Her hands didn't stop pruning. A tiny, perfect leaf fell to the polished wooden floor. It's a lovely charity, dear. Caroline manages it beautifully. She has a real eye for talent. Her voice was smooth, frictionless. It funds abstract painting and portraiture, I continued, my voice low and steady. The art you used to paint. She finally paused, holding the tiny shears mid-snip. She looked at me, her eyes a deep, unwavering gray. I gave up painting for the family, Claire, a choice I never regretted. It was a frivolous, youthful indulgence. The foundation ensures other young women don't have to make that sacrifice. It was the perfect answer. The lie was always a deflection wrapped in a layer of nobility. I took a deep breath. No, I think the foundation is the tax-deductible payment for the life you were forced to give up. I think Richard didn't just want to marry you, he wanted to own your entire emotional landscape. And he used Caroline to do it. The shears clicked, pruning the bonsai root a little too aggressively. You use very dramatic language, Claire. That's New York talking. This is Charleston. We manage, we endure, we survive. Richard and I have an arrangement that has preserved 2 generations of security and stability. At the cost of your soul, Grandma, and Caroline's? I leaned forward, my voice breaking slightly. Did you really think that letting him control the only person you ever truly loved, keeping her close, but untouchable, was worth the Montgomery name? For a long moment, Evelyn was silent. She stared at the bonsai, and I saw a tremor run through her usually rigid posture. It wasn't the composure of the performer, it was the stillness of a woman who had been fighting an invisible war for decades. The Montgomery name is everything, Claire, she finally whispered, not looking at me. It is protection. It is power. What is love without power? A vulnerability, a weakness that can be exploited and destroyed. I chose strength. I chose the strength to keep the person I valued most close, even if it meant she had to be defined by his allowance. The only way to keep Caroline was to put her under the Montgomery umbrella. It was a staggering justification. She hadn't been a victim, but a strategist, making the monstrous trade-off. She had chosen control over freedom, and stability over passion, and Richard, in his cold brilliance, had agreed, because it ensured both women were permanently bound to his empire. But you're perpetuating the cycle, I argued, my voice tight with frustration. You are teaching Peter and me that love is a transaction, a liability to be controlled, not a force to be trusted. You are teaching us that true intimacy is the thing that must be hidden the deepest. Evelyn slowly lifted her gaze to me. Her eyes were suddenly bright with unshed tears, the first genuine emotion I had seen since the 3-second video flickered on the screen. And what do you think happened to the young woman who painted that portrait, Claire? She asked, her voice raspy. The one who loved without calculating the cost? She burned. She became nothing. You think I chose this perfectly controlled life because it was easy? I chose it because the alternative was annihilation. and I had a son to protect. She reached out and placed her aged, manicured hand over mine. The weight of her touch was immense. Don't judge my silence, darling. It was a shelter, but the storm outside was always Richard, and the world he commanded. The room fell into a loaded silence. I realized my grandmother was not just defending her life. She was trying to save mine. She was giving me the deepest, most painful warning she could offer. The cost of being real in this family is everything. I had to change the approach. I needed to move beyond the verbal confrontation and find a way to access the truth without forcing her hand. I spent the rest of the day observing Evelyn, watching for the tiny subconscious cracks that betrayed the real woman beneath the matriarch. I noticed her habit of avoiding certain hallways, certain windows, always staying within the brightly lit, heavily trafficked areas. She seemed to be subconsciously avoiding the shadows, the places where memory resided. Late that night, I was walking past the lower gallery, a dimly lit area filled with old, forgotten artifacts. I saw Evelyn there, sitting on a low, antique bench, seemingly lost in thought. She wasn't holding a book or a glass of wine. She was simply sitting, staring at a wall of old framed photographs. These were not the formal portraits from the party. They were random, candid shots. As I approached quietly, I realized she wasn't looking at any of the photos of Richard or Peter. She was staring intently at a large, framed map of Charleston from the 1970s, which had been hung next to an old, wooden chest. The map meant nothing to me, but then I saw her hand. She was holding a small, silver locket, running her thumb over its surface. She never wore jewelry that wasn't diamond and gold. This locket was tarnished, cheap, and sentimental. She opened the locket just a crack. I didn't need to see the picture inside. I knew it was Caroline. But then, the final, crucial puzzle piece clicked into place. Evelyn didn't just stand up and walk away. Before she left, she performed a small, almost ceremonial action. She took a tiny dried flower, a dried pressed daisy, the kind you might press in a book, from the pocket of her dressing gown, and tucked it carefully, quickly, into a small, carved wooden box that sat on top of the antique chest. The chest itself was unremarkable. Old oak, with heavy iron fittings. I waited until she was gone, the quiet click of her bedroom door signaling her retreat into the private sanctity of her perfect marriage. I walked over to the chest. It was locked, but the map of Charleston. Why was she looking at the map? And the small, carved box she had placed the dried flower in, sitting on top of the locked chest. I looked closer at the box. It was a beautiful piece of carving, small and intricate. I ran my fingers over the dark, cool wood, and then I felt it, a minute, barely perceptible groove on the side of the box. A number, carved deep, but discreetly. The number was 412. I looked back at the framed map. It wasn't just a map. It was an old cadastral map of the historic district. And near the harbor, 1 block away from the obscure cafe where I met Caroline, there was a tiny, insignificant street. On that street, one of the old row houses was circled in faint pencil. The address, 412. I understood immediately. The wooden chest was a memory box. The dried flower was a sacrifice. The address was a secret, a place from the past. And Evelyn, in her moment of utter exposure, hadn't just confessed to me. She had given me the final key, a coded map to the exact location of the original love, the place where Evelyn and Caroline's relationship truly blossomed, and where the video showing Richard's possession was likely filmed. The past wasn't buried. It was waiting for me at 412. The carved number and the faint pencil mark on the map were Evelyn's final, desperate attempt to unburden her soul. She hadn't confessed verbally. She had confessed cartographically. She had given me the coordinates of her lost life. The next morning, I told Peter I was going downtown to handle a pressing personal matter and drove straight to the address, 412. The street was narrow, cobbled, and quiet, a forgotten pocket of the historic district where the imposing white columns of the Montgomery elite gave way to more modest, brightly colored row houses. It felt different from the suffocating grandeur of the estate. It felt real. Number 412 was a small, 3-story house with chipping blue paint and a tiny, overgrown courtyard. It looked exactly like the kind of place a young, passionate artist, Evelyn, the painter, would have chosen as a studio. I parked my car a block away and approached the house nervously. A faded for sale sign stood in the unkempt front yard, suggesting the property had been quietly liquidated or abandoned. I walked up to the front door, half expecting it to be locked tight. To my surprise, the lock was old and loose, and the door creaked open with only a gentle push, sighing on rusty hinges. The air inside was stale, heavy with the scent of dust, mold, and old turpentine. The light filtering through the grime-streaked windows was weak and golden. It was a time capsule. The first floor was a small empty living area, but the stairs led up to a spacious, light-filled room that had clearly been a studio. An easel still stood in the center, though the canvas on it was blank and brittle. The walls were covered in faint, ghostly outlines where frames had hung for decades. This was where Evelyn had painted Caroline. This was where Evelyn was Evelyn, before Richard imposed the Montgomery identity on her. I felt a profound sense of melancholy, standing in the grave of her creative and emotional life. The room was empty, yet filled with echoes. I walked slowly, running my hands over the rough plaster walls. I wasn't looking for a document, I was looking for a feeling. In one corner, near a high, arched window, I noticed a small, built-in storage cabinet, the kind an artist would use for storing solvents or brushes. It was secured by a tiny brass latch. I pulled the latch, it squeaked, and opened the door. Inside, there was a single, small wooden box, different from the one in the mansion, but carved in the same style. Old oak, heavy, with the faint, comforting smell of lavender and age. On top of the box was a folded piece of paper. I picked up the paper first. It was a note, written in Evelyn's elegant, looping hand, but the script was slightly younger, more fluid. It wasn't addressed to me, but to Caroline. It was dated 1974. I unfolded it and read the words, my hands trembling. Caroline, I'm sending you the final installment for the studio rent. Richard insists. He says it must be done this way. It must look like I'm cutting the cord entirely, that my focus is on the future, on Peter, on the life he has built for us. But the cord is not cut, my love. It is merely stretched thin. He believes he controls us through his payments and his presence. He believes he has forced me to choose the name over the soul. But he hasn't. I have made a bargain with the silence. I will uphold the facade, but I will not erase you. I have hidden the evidence of us, not destroyed it. And as long as you remain close, under his watchful, arrogant eye, you are my defiance. You are the piece of my heart I managed to smuggle out of the marriage. I need you to stay in Charleston, my dear. I need to know you are breathing the same humid air, even if we cannot speak the truth of it. This is the only way I can survive this perfection. Yours, always, E. The note was a brutal, beautiful confirmation. It wasn't Richard who forced Caroline to stay. It was Evelyn. She had used Richard's adultery and his control as a shield to orchestrate her own tragedy, a life of forced proximity with the woman she loved, sustained by the very enemy who separated them. The payment wasn't just for silence. It was for presence. I put the note down and opened the small wooden box. It was a compartment for the final, devastating reveal. Inside, there was no more money, no diamonds. There was only one thing, a small, black and white photograph. It was taken in this very room, by the high window. It showed Evelyn and Caroline. They were standing close, their heads touching, looking out at the street. Richard was nowhere in the frame, but that wasn't the core of the revelation. In the center of the photo, held tightly in the crook of Evelyn's arm, was a newborn baby, wrapped in a blanket. The baby was sleeping soundly, utterly unaware of the tragic performance about to consume its life. The baby's face was unmistakable. It was Peter. I stared at the image, the entire structure of the Montgomery dynasty collapsing around me in a rush of air and dust. Peter, my uncle, the heir to the Montgomery name, the symbol of the perfect marriage. But Peter was in Evelyn's arms, next to Caroline, and the date on the back of the photo, faded but still visible, was 1973, 2 years before the date in the public photo albums. The truth was a sudden, sickening clarity. Richard wasn't just cheating on Evelyn with Caroline. Richard had married Evelyn while she was already deeply in love with Caroline. The relationship with Caroline wasn't just an affair, it was the initial, true partnership. The video the night of the party hadn't shown Richard cheating on Evelyn, it had shown him asserting his claim over Caroline, the mother of the child he needed to secure his dynasty. Peter wasn't Richard's son. Peter was the product of Evelyn's brief, desperate, and true love. The final monstrous cruelty of Richard Montgomery was revealed. He didn't just force Evelyn to live with her lover, he forced Evelyn to raise her son, the product of that love, under his name, under his control, as the heir to his throne. The entire Montgomery Steele empire was built on a lie of paternity. This explained everything: Richard's suffocating need for control over Peter, Peter's constant anxiety, his feeling of not belonging, Caroline's silent, lifelong attachment to the family. She wasn't just the ex-lover, she was the biological co-parent, allowed to watch her son grow up from a distance, bought and paid for by the foundation that bore her name. I felt a profound empathy for Evelyn. She hadn't made a terrible choice. She had been given an impossible one. Richard must have discovered the truth of Peter's paternity and leveraged the secret, the threat of scandal, the ruin of Peter's future, to force Evelyn into the marriage, making Caroline the eternal, silent co-conspirator. Her greatest love became her greatest vulnerability. I put the photo and the letter back into the box, closing the cabinet door softly. My hands were shaking, not just from the cold, but from the immense weight of the revelation. This was not a story of infidelity. It was a grand Southern Gothic tragedy about power, paternity, and the price of a dynasty. I left 412, closing the door as gently as I had opened it, leaving the silent ghosts to their peace. I drove back toward the mansion, the perfect white columns now looking like the bars of a gilded cage. I knew my mission had fundamentally changed. I was no longer an investigator. I was an executioner of the lie. I had to free Peter, free Evelyn, and free myself from the legacy of this terrible, suffocating secret. I had to shatter the performance forever. The drive back to the mansion was the longest journey of my life. I was no longer Claire the journalist. I was Claire, the reluctant keeper of a devastating truth. The knowledge of Peter's paternity, that he was the son of Evelyn and Caroline, raised as the heir of Richard, was a seismic truth. It didn't just change the past, it decimated the entire emotional foundation of the Montgomery family. I felt a sudden, fierce rush of adrenaline. I needed to move fast. Richard was too powerful, too accustomed to controlling the narrative. If he caught a hint of my discovery, he would deploy his legal and financial arsenal to bury not just the truth, but me too. I went straight to the heart of the crisis. Evelyn. I found her in her private sitting room, a space decorated in soft blues and whites that felt strangely detached from the rest of the house. She was drinking tea, reading a fragile volume of poetry, the image of quiet, perfect serenity. I didn't sit down. I stood in front of her, holding the weight of the little wooden box and the old map in my mind. "Grandma," I said, my voice steady, stripped of all journalistic neutrality or childish fear. I went to 412. The hand holding the poetry volume didn't move, but I watched the porcelain-smooth skin around her jaw tighten, just for a moment. She knew exactly what 412 meant. It was the address of her truth. "It's a charming area," she replied, her voice still measured, still the performer. "A bit neglected now, perhaps." "It's neglected because it's a tomb, Grandma, the tomb of your heart." I didn't allow her to look away. I found the note to Caroline, the one from 1904, the one where you told her that the cord was merely stretched thin, not cut. The one where you explained that you needed her to stay close, under Richard's eye, because her presence was your defiance. The poetry volume slid from her hand, hitting the thick carpet with a soft thud. It wasn't the impact that mattered, but the fact that her practiced grip had failed. "You read too many novels, Claire. You confuse drama with reality." "I read a photograph, Grandma. A photograph of you, Caroline, and a newborn baby in that studio. A baby born in 1973, 2 years before Peter Montgomery was officially documented as the heir." I let the words hang there, heavy, final. "Peter is Caroline's son, not Richard's." Evelyn closed her eyes. She didn't deny it. The fight went out of her, replaced by a terrible, absolute exhaustion. When she opened her eyes again, they were wet, but there were no tears. Just the raw pain of a half-century of suppression. "Richard found out," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "He found out the moment Peter was born. I was young, Claire, foolish. I thought love could withstand a little secret. Richard gave me a choice. Marry him, let him claim Peter as his heir, and I would save the Montgomery name, save Peter from the scandal of illegitimacy. And in return, Caroline could stay in Charleston, kept close, funded, under the umbrella of our friendship. Or I could refuse, and he would use his power to ruin all of us, destroy my career, destroy Caroline's life, and ensure Peter would be forever marked as the bastard son of 2 women in a deeply conservative southern city. So you chose the cage, I said, the pity in my voice mixing with a deep horror. I chose Peter's future. I chose stability over anarchy. Evelyn's voice rose, a flash of her old fire returning. I chose to survive, and I chose the only way to keep Caroline near, even if it meant she was defined by his paycheck. It was a twisted love, Claire, a poisonous proximity, but it was all I had left. Richard didn't win by making us hate each other. He won by forcing us to live together in his lie. I understood the monstrous logic now. Richard had not only hijacked their child, he had forced Evelyn and Caroline to participate in their own punishment, using their love for each other as the very mechanism of their enslavement. But what about Peter, Grandma? He is living his life under a lie of paternity that is crushing him. The Montgomery Steel empire is built on a lie of inheritance. That is not stability. It is a time bomb. He is the heir, Claire. He has the protection. That is enough. It is not enough. I stepped closer, my hands gripping the back of the velvet chair. It's killing him. He walks around this house terrified. Peter the fixer, trying desperately to earn the approval of a man who isn't his father. He lives in a shadow he can't name, and you are watching him do it. Richard didn't just break you. He broke the next generation with your silence. My words struck her like physical blows. Evelyn finally looked devastated, truly broken. What am I supposed to do now, Claire? Ruin him? Ruin everything I sacrificed my life for? You're supposed to tell the truth, I said simply. Not for the papers, not for the world, but for Peter, for Caroline, and for the young woman who painted that portrait. You need to cut the cord, not to Caroline, but to Richard. You need to admit that the greatest sin wasn't the love, it was the silence. Evelyn was silent, her eyes distant, lost in the decades. The choice I offered was terrifying: destroy the legacy of 50 years, or continue to watch her son crumble. I knew I had to act immediately, while the knowledge was still fresh, and the shock had weakened her defenses. I walked out, leaving her alone with the pieces of her perfect life. I went to find Peter. He was in the study, meticulously organizing stacks of company reports. He was the picture of the dutiful son, the anxious servant of the Montgomery name. "Peter, stop!" I commanded. Standing in the doorway, he looked up, startled by the urgency in my voice. "Claire, I can't stop. I have to finalize the Q3 reports. Dad wants them on his desk before lunch. Richard Montgomery is not your father, Peter." The words were so direct, so bold, they didn't even register at first. Peter's brow furrowed in confusion. "What? That's ridiculous. What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about 1973. I'm talking about a studio at 4 to 12. I'm talking about a photo of your mother, Caroline, and you as a newborn." I walked over to his desk and slammed my hand down, right next to the Q3 reports. "Peter, your mother and Caroline were in love. You are their son. Richard Montgomery found out and forced your mother to trade her life and your true paternity for the Montgomery name and the promise of stability." Peter's face went white, then mottled red. His entire body started to tremble violently. "That's a lie. A vile, sick journalistic fabrication. My father is Richard Montgomery. He built this company. He raised me." "Yes, he raised you, he controlled you, he used you as the ultimate piece of armor for his name. And look at yourself, Peter. You're 49 years old and still desperate for the approval of a man who is only your father in name. You're not his blood. That's why you're never good enough. That's why you're always the anxious fixer. Because Richard doesn't see his son. He sees his prisoner, the living proof of his victory over the 2 women he broke." The dam broke. Peter collapsed into his chair, covering his face with his hands. He didn't cry. He just let out a choked, desperate sound. The sound of 49 years of inexplicable anxiety finally finding its name. I didn't try to comfort him. I let the truth burn. When he finally looked up, his eyes were lost, completely untethered. "Then, who is Caroline?" he whispered, his voice broken. "She's your mother, Peter. The one who stayed close, accepting Richard's money, just so she could watch you grow up from a distance. The one your mother fought to keep in your life. It wasn't an affair. It was the price of your survival. The only person who ever truly fought for your well-being in this house was your real mother, Evelyn, and the woman who helped give you life, Caroline." Peter stood up slowly, the crumpled Q3 reports falling to the floor. For the first time, he didn't look anxious. He looked terrifyingly calm. He looked at the window, the sunlight streaming in. He was finally free of the impossible weight of Richard's expectations. I knew Richard was coming. The moment was now or never. I looked at Peter. What do you do now, Peter? Do you continue to live the lie that is killing you? Or do you walk away, a free man? Peter didn't answer me. He simply walked out of the room, leaving the reports, the symbolic chain of his servitude behind him. Minutes later, I heard the roar of Richard's voice from the foyer, the sound of an emperor enraged. He had clearly heard about my conversations, or perhaps sensed the shift in the air. "Claire, get down here now! What lies have you been spreading?" I knew I couldn't face him alone, but I didn't have to. I walked to the top of the stairs and looked down. Richard was standing at the base, red-faced, terrifying, his hand gripping the banister like a weapon. Evelyn was standing nearby, rigid, watching. And then I saw Peter. Peter had walked out of the mansion and into the garden. He was standing on the lawn, the expanse of the Montgomery estate around him. He took his phone out, and I heard the faint, distant, but unmistakable sound of him making a phone call. He was calling Caroline. Richard saw him too. "Peter, get back here. You are not leaving this property. You have reports to sign." Peter turned, and for the first time, he looked Richard Montgomery straight in the eye, without fear. His voice, carried on the air, was clear and loud, devoid of all his usual nervous stammering. "No, Richard," Peter said. "I am done signing your papers, and I am done being your son." Richard froze. The statement was not just a rejection, it was an execution of his power. Peter lowered his phone. He looked at the imposing house, the symbol of the lie, and he started walking toward the gate. He didn't run. He walked with a quiet, powerful determination, finally carrying his own weight. I looked at Evelyn. Her eyes were fixed on her son walking away, his back straight. A single tear tracked down her cheek, but it wasn't a tear of pain. It was a tear of release. The cage had opened. The heavy silence that followed Peter's simple statement was more devastating than any physical fight. Richard Montgomery, the patriarch, the man who controlled boardrooms and politicians, stood frozen at the foot of the stairs, utterly dismantled by 3 seconds of truth. Peter did not look back. He simply walked, a man shedding a lifetime of imprisonment with every step. I watched him go until the iron gates swallowed his retreating figure. Richard's face, which a moment ago was a mask of towering rage, now twisted into something pitiful and terrifying. He looked up at Evelyn, who remained still and silent, and then his eyes snapped to me. I was standing at the top of the grand staircase, the only witness who held all the pieces of his colossal lie. "You!" he spat, his voice no longer the booming patriarch's command, but a guttural, wounded sound. "You did this! You came back here and poisoned everything." I slowly descended the stairs. Each step was deliberate, carrying the weight of the last 50 years of family history. I met him on the marble floor of the foyer, inches away from the Persian rug, where they often staged their perfect holiday photos. "I didn't poison anything, grandfather," I said, my voice quiet but cutting through the silence of the house. "The poison was 50 years old. I just opened the window." He raised his hand, as if to strike me, but stopped, his fingers clenching into a trembling, useless fist. His power had always been the ability to intimidate, to threaten financial and social ruin. With Peter gone, the main piece of the dynasty he fought to protect had abandoned him. His threats were meaningless. "Peter will come back," he hissed, his eyes manic. "He's weak. He's always been weak. He'll realize the value of the name, the value of the protection I gave him." "Peter is not weak, Richard. He was suffocated. And you didn't give him protection. You gave him a life sentence as a servant of your ego." I felt no fear now, only a cold, cleansing clarity. He's not coming back. He finally knows that the man he was trying to please wasn't his father, that he wasn't a Montgomery by blood, but a prisoner by contract. I watched the realization hit him. Not the scandal, but the failure of his control. He had spent half a century forcing the product of Evelyn's true love to carry his name and serve his empire. Now that product had walked away, rendering his greatest victory obsolete. And Evelyn. Richard turned, his voice pleading and desperate, reaching for his last ally. "Evelyn, tell her! Tell her this is madness! Tell her we made a life! Tell her we saved him from ruin!" Evelyn, who had been a statue of controlled grief, finally spoke. Her voice was low and steady, aimed directly at Richard. We saved him from the truth, Richard, and in doing so, we ruined his soul. The price of this life was too high. She didn't look at me. She was addressing the man who had been her keeper. I kept my promise. I stayed silent. I kept the house. I kept your name clean. But Peter's freedom is the only thing left that is truly mine. I will not call him back. This was Evelyn's final, silent divorce. She was choosing the imperfect, chaotic truth of her son's path over the sterile perfection of her marriage. Richard Montgomery, the great architect of the Dynasty, was now standing alone in the ruins of his own making. He finally broke. He sank onto the bottom step of the staircase, suddenly looking every bit of his 73 years. He covered his face, and I heard him mutter a sound of pure, unadulterated loss. It wasn't regret. It was the howl of a megalomaniac whose ultimate project had been rendered worthless. I walked past him. The fight was over. There was no victory party, no sense of triumph, only the quiet, heavy relief of an illness finally purging itself. I went to the attic. I retrieved the rolled canvas, the vibrant portrait of Caroline, from beneath the floorboards. I was taking the truth with me, not to expose, but to hold. Then I went to my room and packed a single, small suitcase. I didn't need the clothes I had worn here, the clothes of the wealthy, compromised granddaughter. I just needed my New York shell and my laptop. I found Evelyn back in her sunroom. She was no longer reading. She was simply looking out at the magnolia tree, the sprawling symbol of Charlestonian permanence. I placed the rolled canvas on the table in front of her. I found it, Grandma. It's beautiful. You were a magnificent artist. She touched the rough canvas gently. Her eyes filled with a tenderness that had been absent for decades. I kept it because it was the only piece of my past Richard couldn't truly touch. He could fund the foundation. He could control Caroline's presence, but he couldn't destroy that feeling. He could only force me to hide it. I'm leaving, Grandma, I said. I'm going back to New York, and I'm going to trust the simple life, the imperfect life, the one that hasn't been edited or bought. She nodded slowly. Go. Don't ever look back at this perfection. It will trap you. Don't ever live your life as a reaction to my fear. I paused. What will you do, Grandma? Evelyn looked out at the garden, where Richard was still sitting on the stairs, a crumpled figure. I am the Queen of Charleston, Claire. I will not leave the throne. But the terms of the monarchy have changed. The dynasty is over. The silence is broken. I will manage the collapse. And for the first time in 50 years, I will do it without the weight of his lie or the fear of his control. She picked up the small, empty, beautifully carved wooden box, the one that had held the dried flower and the key to the address. She held it out to me. Take this, she said. It was a gift from Caroline, before everything. It was meant to hold secrets. I want you to take it and put something real inside, something imperfect, something true. I took the box. It was cool and smooth in my palm, a symbolic vessel for a new kind of inheritance. Our goodbye wasn't sentimental. It was an acknowledgement of a shared trauma and a mutually earned freedom. I hugged her, a brief, fierce squeeze of connection, and then I walked away. My final act was at the front door. The brass knocker, shaped like a grim lion's head, was a symbol of the family's predatory power. I stopped and looked back at the house. The towering columns, the perfect white paint, the impenetrable elegance. It was stunning and utterly devoid of soul. I thought of the words I wanted to write, the message I had been tasked with delivering. A new breath, imperfect, but true. The silence was the core of the problem. It was the cement Richard used to bind them. I took the small, tarnished silver locket Evelyn had been holding. When I found her looking at the map, she must have left it on the sunroom table. I knew what was inside. A photo of her and Caroline. I walked out onto the porch, to the edge of the manicured lawn. The lawn that Peter had just walked across to freedom. I opened the locket, placed the tiny, precious photo of the two young women back inside, and closed it. I took the locket in my hand, and with a silent, profound commitment to the truth, I raised my arm and hurled the object, the symbol of 50 years of repressed love and controlled silence, into the sprawling, dark depths of the old Montgomery well at the edge of the property. I heard the tiny, satisfying plink as it hit the dark water far below. The memory was enough. The physical evidence of the prison, the locket, the perfect house, the name, had to be surrendered. The truth was now internal. I got into my car. As I drove away, past the heavy iron gates that now felt ridiculously thin, I looked in the rearview mirror one last time. The house was bathed in the harsh, late afternoon sun. It was just a house. A very expensive, very beautiful lie. The road ahead was open. I was driving toward New York, toward Ethan, toward a life where I would allow love to be messy, vulnerable, and real. I would be a participant in my life, not a reluctant actress in someone else's performance. I would choose connection over control. I would choose truth over survival. I thought about Peter, likely on a train or in a rental car, heading toward the coast to find Caroline. He was finally finding his mother, finding his truth. He had lost an empire, but gained his soul. The weight was gone. The air in my lungs was cool and clean. The silence of the car was not oppressive, but liberating. It was the sound of a new beginning. I drove. I didn't turn on the radio or connect my phone. The only sound was the low hum of the engine, a welcome contrast to the oppressive silence and the constant, demanding noise of the Montgomery house. The further I got from those white columns, those moss-covered lies, the lighter my chest felt. It was a physical shedding of armor. The truth I carried wasn't a sensational headline anymore. It was a scar, a definitive marker of where the healing began. Peter was free. Evelyn was finally honest with her pain, and Richard, the great architect, was left to preside over a kingdom of dust and echoing silence. He still had his money, his name, his political leverage, but he had lost the one thing that made his power absolute, the control over the narrative of his own family. I thought about the box Evelyn had given me, the beautifully carved piece of oak that Caroline had gifted her so long ago. It was supposed to hold secrets. I had inherited it, not to fill it with new lies, but to fill it with the raw, imperfect material of a life finally lived without performance. I placed it on the passenger seat, a compass pointing north towards sincerity. As I drove through the outer stretches of Charleston, past the familiar, humid marshes and the ancient live oaks, the memory of the past weeks cycled through my mind. I saw Evelyn's face when she admitted the choice she had made, trading a life of love and art for the precarious, controlled survival of her son. She had made a monstrous choice, but it was driven by a desperate, flawed love. She sacrificed her truth to save Peter from scandal, only to sacrifice his happiness in the process. I realized then that the Montgomery tragedy wasn't one of simple betrayal, but one of misplaced priorities. They believed that reputation, status, and the Montgomery name were the ultimate forms of protection. They treated the soul as a liability that needed to be insured by wealth and sealed by silence. I pulled over to a rest stop overlooking the vast expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. The air here was sharp with salt and promise. I got out of the car, breathing deeply, feeling the wind clean the residual smoke of the mansion from my lungs. I pulled out my laptop, not to write a story for the Times, but to write my own ending. I needed to capture the final message, the lesson learned in the crucible of that southern gloom. The act of writing, of articulating the emotional architecture of the family, was the final stage of my freedom. I wrote about Peter, not as the anxious heir, but as the man who walked away from an entire empire to claim his biological mother and his own truth. He proved that an imperfect, broken freedom was infinitely more valuable than a perfect, suffocating inheritance. I thought of Caroline, likely preparing for the most honest, chaotic conversation of her life. She would finally get to be a mother, not just a dear friend. Her years of silent service, paid for by the foundation, were over. The money no longer mattered. The bond was all that counted. The financial entanglement had been the prison, but the love for Peter was the unbreakable chain that had kept her tied to Evelyn and to the city, waiting. My journalist mind wanted to find the neat conclusion, the final twist that would explain the whole conspiracy. But the truth I found was messy, heartbreaking, and human. The core of the story wasn't the affair or the paternity. It was the catastrophic failure of trust. Evelyn trusted Richard's power to protect, rather than trusting the resilience of her own love. And that failure created a ripple effect of silence and pain that lasted 50 years. I wrote down the message I had been given at the start, the thesis statement of my own emotional life. A new breath, imperfect, but true. This breath was mine. It was the decision to look at Ethan, my simple, honest partner, and choose trust over the inherited instinct for suspicion. It was the commitment to allow my life to be flawed, vulnerable, and subject to the inevitable chaos of genuine emotion rather than trying to perform the perfect life the Montgomery name demanded. I wrote for hours, until the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and violet, a beautiful, imperfect mess. The total word count of my private manuscript grew, each paragraph cementing my break from the past. I realized that the deepest loyalty I owed was not to my family name, but to the truth of my own experience. I had seen what silence does to the soul. I had witnessed the human cost of valuing reputation over authenticity. My inheritance was not the money or the mansion. It was the profound lesson in the necessity of speaking one's truth, even when it threatens to shatter the world around you. The final scene in my mind was not a confrontation, but a solitary moment of peace. I imagined myself walking along a small, deserted beach in the early morning light, the kind of beach where the sand is cold and the sea leaves behind fragments of shells and driftwood, things broken but refined by the journey. The air smells of salt and the unknown. I am walking, the carved wooden box tucked into the pocket of my coat. I stop and kneel in the wet sand. I take the box out. It is empty, waiting to be filled. I look out at the vast, indifferent ocean, the very opposite of the confined, controlled world of Charleston society. I don't fill the box with anything grand. I pick up a small, smooth gray stone, worn round by the constant action of the waves. It is utterly unremarkable. It is imperfect. It has cracks and flaws. I drop the stone into the box. It makes a dull, satisfying thud. This is the new inheritance. Not gold, not control, but a simple, imperfect stone. A reminder that life is about collecting these small, real fragments, not preserving the polished illusion. I close the box. I am ready. I get back in the car. I leave the coast, the marsh, the magnolias, and the ghosts behind me. I drive north, toward the noisy, honest chaos of New York, ready to live a life where the cracks are visible, but the foundation is sound. The message is complete. The cycle of silence is broken.